Hello and welcome to today's Partner Infopedia web conference. You've joined us for a fast track for D365 operations, Tech Talk, servicing. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Senior R&D Solution Architect, Sunil Garg. Sunil, over to you.
Thanks, Janice. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Sunil Garg, and I'm part of the fast track team for Dynamics 365 for operations at Microsoft. So today's session is about servicing for Dynamics 365 for operations. As part of this session, we'll take a look at some of the key scenarios that fall in the servicing bucket around code promotions. We'll take a look at data refreshes, and we'll also take a look at other kind of requests that one can make to get certain things accomplished on a specific environment. So we will also look at some demos that to actually see how we can go and do some of these operations. So from a logistic perspective, please type in your questions into the IM window, like Janice mentioned, and we will take the questions towards the end of the discussion. So looking at the scenarios for servicing, we can actually categorize the scenarios into 4 high-level buckets. The first set of scenarios will be around code promotion. And what we mean by code promotion is once you have your deployable package generated from your build environment, then there will be need to apply those deployable packages to Sandbox environments and also to production environment once it is ready. So these are the scenarios that fall under code promotion. And as part of the demos, we will actually see how we can deploy code to Sandbox. Then what is the process to identify a release candidate, which can be then promoted to production. So there is an entire process around how we can promote code eventually to production. So we'll take a look at that flow in the demo. Then we will move on to scenarios around data refreshes. So when we talk about data refresh, it falls under 2 subcategories, if you will. The first set of data refresh scenarios will be around copying data from one environment to the other environment. So this environment could be a source Sandbox environment to another Sandbox environment as the target, or it could be a production environment from where we want to bring data down to a Sandbox environment. So we will take a look at these flows in the demo as to how we can go and accomplish these scenarios. The second subcategory in data refresh is point-in-time restore. So for example, we have deployed golden configuration in a Sandbox environment, and we have started testing. Now, at some point in time, we have run into a situation where we have to restore back the golden configuration or to any state for that matter on that specific Sandbox environment. So there is point-in-time restore options available from LCS that we will see how we can go and actually take advantage of that, where we can request to restore the database back to a point in time in the last 35 days on the Sandbox and also on production, which is not live yet. Now, one thing that I wanted to clarify here is when we talk about production-related scenarios, you will always hear me distinguish between production that is not live versus production that is live, simply because there are some additional checks and balances, some additional scrutiny, if you will, for the lack of a better term, that happens behind the scene once the customer is live on a production environment. So if there are additional operations that are being requested to perform on such a production environment, then there's a different flow, which we'll take a look at that, versus a production environment that was deployed, but it is not live yet. So that's the reason why we will distinguish between these different scenarios. So moving on to the data refresh related scenarios, the third bucket here is in LCS, there is an option to create service requests of type other. So this is like a catch-all service request. What this should not be used for. So since it is other, we have seen cases where we get requests that we cannot really honor those requests. So we'll talk about that as well as we go along the session as to what should be done and what should not be done as part of the other requests. But what we have listed here are the frequently known scenarios where the other type of requests is used. So basically, the first set of scenarios under that falls under data refresh, where if we want to request data refresh to production that is not live from a sandbox, then we will use the other request. Similarly, if there is a need to do a point-in-time restore on a production environment itself that is not live, then we will use the other request. Some of the other things for which we will use this process will be to put the system in maintenance mode. For example, you may want to go and update configuration keys and whatnot. So you can put a request to bring the system in maintenance mode. The other scenario will be if there is a ISV license file that needs to be deployed, the other request needs to be utilized. The last two scenarios will be a data mart reset that is required for MR and for updating SQL stats from a performance perspective. So one quick note on the data mart reset for MR is that even though you can put a service request to get your MR database reset, but the expectation is that you should also follow up with a support ticket for that specific scenario that you ran into for which you want to do a data mart reset, right? Because if you think about that specific scenario, there was potentially some bug in the product somewhere along the line that is forcing you to do a data mart reset for MR. So we certainly want to capture that scenario so that we are able to go and address that in a proper way via a hot fix for that specific use case. But we also recognize that the project cannot wait until that hotfix is available, and hence you should go ahead and anyways request a service request or put in a service request for getting the data mart reset done in the meantime. So this is something that we encourage and should be followed for any situations where it could be a potential product bug, but we still want to go ahead with the project, with the implementation. So that is where we take this two-pronged approach where you can log in a service request to get things done, but at the same time you should also follow up with a support ticket so that that specific scenario is not lost to be addressed in the product. The last set of scenarios here is this falls in the bucket where you will have to log a Microsoft support ticket to actually get some aspect of servicing done. Now, these scenarios would be rare, but this does not mean that a specific implementation will not run into the scenario. For example, there could be scenarios where you need a data refresh to happen via a copy from a sandbox, even after it was live, even after the customer went live, due to some unforeseeable reasons, right? So there is a process to handle such scenarios where you can log in a support ticket first, and then you can describe the situation that got us into that specific state. And then you can request either a data copy from an existing sandbox, or you can request a point-in-time restore on the same production environment. Now, the reason why we want us to go through the support channel is because the support team will work with the customer and partners implementation team to fully understand the reasons as to why the production environment is in a state where we are anticipating a data refresh. So ideally that should not have happened, but if that has happened, then some amount of diagnosis is required to understand if that is the right thing to do, or if there are other options that are available. Hence, the support team is the first point of contact in such cases. And once the support team has determined that, yes, either a point-in-time restore or a database copy from a sandbox is the right thing to do, then the support team will work with Microsoft DSC behind the scene, and they will get the help that is required to get the data back on the production. So these are the key scenarios in a servicing flow. And when we talk about servicing, the other important aspect is what is the lead time and what is the downtime. So I have this table here. I will not read through this table because you will all get this content, which you can always go and take a look at. But basically, this is calling out the lead time and downtime for each of the scenarios that we talked about, and also who is going to perform that specific service operation. So anyway, so right now, the customer and partner is one who performs a code promotion to a sandbox. And that is a real-time operation that starts right away when you schedule it. And hence, there is no lead time as such. But the rest of the operations are handled by Microsoft DSE directly or in collaboration with Microsoft support, as we talked about it in the previous use case. And the corresponding lead times and downtimes are mentioned here. Now, having said that, our goal is to always have as much self-service as possible from LCS, meaning our desire is to get the lead time to a very minimal to zero, if not, at some point in time. So that is something that we need to understand and keep in mind that this is the current state of things, but our goal is to make self-service for each of these scenarios. So with that, let me quickly jump into the demo. So what we see here is a implementation project. This is a typical implementation project that we all are familiar with. And what we have here is a lab environment that we have created internally to test and experiment and play with the different scenarios that we enable. So this is our lab environment. This is not a specific customer's environment or customer's project. So the first scenario that we'll take a look at is, try to understand what code promotion is all about and how we can do that. So from a code promotion perspective, once the deployable package is ready from your build environment, it could be a X++ deployable package, or it could be just a binary hotfix package that you downloaded from LCS. Basically, that package has to be uploaded into the asset library in the software deployable package asset type. So right now I have two deployable packages that I have uploaded here just for demonstration purposes. So now once I have the deployable packages in the asset library, I can go to my Sandbox environment where I want to deploy the deployable package. And then I can go into the maintain option here, and I can say apply updates. And when I click apply updates, we get this option where we can choose one of the two deployable packages that we want to deploy on this specific environment. So if I choose this specific deployable package and I say apply, it is going to go and schedule the deployment right away. So I will not do that because it's going to block the environment from using this through the demo. So I will cancel for now. But what I have is an environment where I had already applied the deployable package, and it has completed the deployment in about an hour, hour and a half, right? And once the package deployment is complete, this is the experience that we will see once you go inside that environment. So this may look a little different, but basically what you see here is an expanded tab, environment updates, which is by default expanded if you have not taken an action to close the package deployment operation that you had started. So if I expand this manage environment tab, this is the tab that we are by default used to seeing it when you go inside an environment. So just so you know, it is not a completely different page or anything. It is just a fast tab that just opens by default if the service operation for package deployment is not completed from a process perspective. So right now, this is the experience that we see where the system is telling that 64 out of 64 steps is completed, and everything seems to be good. There is no failure that we can see from here. And now the options are you can still download the log of the runbook, or you can download the runbook itself if you want to analyze it for some reason, or you can sign off, or you can close with issues. So let me talk about when you would use each of these options. So for example, right now everything looks clean, So the process will be that, the functional team or the implementation team in general would go into that environment and they can do their functional validation just to make sure that the package was indeed deployed correctly. And once they're happy with that validation, they can come here and they can sign off. Now, in that process, if they find that there was some issues in the package deployment, which should anyways show up here also, then in that case, they can close this specific operation by clicking close with issues. Now, what happens when you click on close with issues is it basically updates the status to close with issues so that next time when you come into this environment and look at the history, you actually know that this deployment actually failed. So these are different options here where you can manage the status, if you will, based on what the outcome was. So for now, if I say, sign off, so it brings back to the view that we are used to it. It's taking a while, and that operation is now complete. So that is from a code deployment perspective. Now let me come back to this environment here. So if I click on history, so here is when the one that I signed off, and I already had another one just to demonstrate that this is how it looks like when you say close with issues. So this is the flow that one would go to deploy code to a sandbox environment. The next step will be for the team to go and complete their functional validation. And let's say it is the UAT, and the team is going and performing the testing, and all the issues have been resolved, and the build that we deployed right now is the final build that we want to go live with. So basically, the point is we have to come back to the asset library, and then we have to identify that specific build or the package as a release candidate. So right now, I will not mark it as a release candidate. Instead, I am in a production environment. And let's see what happens when I say I want to apply updates. And I actually don't see any deployable package here. That is because in my asset library, I have not told the system if there is any release candidate yet. So once that validation is done and the project team determines that this is indeed the release candidate, you can actually mark this as a release candidate. And then now when you come back, let me cancel this and I click maintain, apply updates again. Then you start seeing that specific package that you had as a release candidate. Now, you may be wondering if you can have multiple release candidates or not. Yes, so in the asset library, you can actually end up having multiple release candidates simply because of the nature of the project itself, right? For example, for CRP1, you would identify one release candidate. Or for example, for subsequent go lives, since we're talking about production, you may end up with multiple release candidates. Now, what you can do is to avoid any confusion, you can always go back and clear release candidate flag from older builds if you end up in that situation, so that it doesn't show up in future deployment experiences wherever it is required. So that is one thing that to keep in mind. So let me put it back into release candidate here. And then when I go back into my production, let me cancel and do this again. And then I can say schedule. So when I say schedule, so it is going to ask us what is the preferred downtime and what is the preferred downtime start and downtime end. So I can change this based on what the requirements are. But one thing to understand is we talked about lead time and the downtime, correct? So the values that are defaulted here, it accounts for the lead time and downtime by default. So for example, for code deployment, it is 8 hours. So it is actually 8 hours ahead of the current time. and the difference will be equal to the required downtime, which is 5 hours. Now, if I were to go back and reduce this to less than 8 hours, and then if I try to confirm, you will get a notification that it has to be at least 8 hours. So let me go back and flip it to 10 p.m. And if I try to reduce the downtime to less than 5 hours, so it will you will still get a notification that it has to be at least 5 hours. So this is something that we have to keep in mind about the lead time and downtime, which accounts for a total of 8 plus 5, 14 hours. So this needs to be accounted for in the planning for the deployment, so that we don't hurry up and this doesn't come as a surprise. So this is, I think, is a key important thing for us to understand. And we are always striving to reduce this, but we should still account for the current lead time and downtime in our planning for deployments. So once I confirm, it's going to there's a notification that we will review, and then we will start based on the provided lead time and downtime, and I'll say yes. So a service request has been submitted for this specific environment, and this is what I wanted to share. So once it is scheduled and until the job gets picked up for execution, which means 8 hours, that was the lead time. So between now and the next 8 hours, I can actually come back and reschedule if I need to reschedule for some reason, or if I determine that the package that I chose was wrong, then I can always come back and then I can pick a different package. It's kind of slow here. If I had another package that was a release candidate, then I could have picked that. So we can do that. Or if we determine that we don't want a deployment right now, I can always cancel the deployment. I will do that later, but one thing I wanted to show was, so we can also add comments for the Microsoft DSE team. If we want to pass on some message to them for them to be aware of, we can always type in a message, and then we can save that message. So this way, there is a communication that starts with the DSE team in the backend. So when they come to take a look at this job, they go through this history and they'll know if there is any additional information that they have to know. So for now, let me just cancel this, and I'll say cancel. So the request is now canceled. So if I go back in history, so I didn't do any other code-related activities on this specific environment. So that is about how code can be deployed to Sandbox, how we can identify a specific deployable package as a release candidate, and how we can promote the release candidate to production, all from LCS. So that is the code promotion scenarios that we talked about. The next set of scenarios will be around data, right? So we talked about point-in-time restore on sandboxes, and we talked about refreshing sandbox from a sandbox or from a production. So let's take a look at how these scenarios can be accomplished. So right now I am in, so the way I navigated to this specific page is via support. And once I select support, by default, you will be in support issues. So you have to switch to the service request tab here. And from the service request tab, you can actually create service requests for refreshing sandboxes with new data. So I can click add. And now what we see is 3 options. And we talked about these 3 options in the one of the first slides. The point-in-time restore, the database refresh request, and then other requests. So we'll take a look at each of these 3 options, and we'll take a look at the flow for each of these 3 options. So now if I choose database point-in-time restore, I have to choose which environment that we are going to do a point-in-time restore on. Now, if you carefully notice, the production environment is not listed here at all. And if you recall, we talked about production environment data refreshes to be handled separately, simply because there is additional checks and balances that happens. So here we can, if we say, sandbox 1, and then we can choose the restore point. We can go back to as far as 35 days in history, and then we can choose a specific time on a specific day where we have to restore the data from. Now, from a process perspective, from a practical, day-to-day project execution perspective, one thing to know will be, the times here are in the increments of 15 minutes, right? So if you are, let's take a scenario, right? So let's say you are updating your configuration on a sandbox tier 2 environment. On a sandbox environment, you are managing your configuration, for example. Now, you are at a point where you believe that that specific configuration is solid, and this should be the baseline. So before you start entering any other transaction or any other information which you do not want to be part of your baseline, make sure that the timestamp that you take note of is in increments of 15 minutes, right? So for example, if you take a timestamp note of is 7 o'clock and 6 minutes, for example, and that is your baseline, and then on the 7th minute you start adding additional data, or you do actions that you do not want to be part of that specific baseline, then you risk either losing some data between 7 o'clock and 7:06 in the 6 minutes if you had done something, or you risk getting some additional activity in your restore which you do not want to be happening. So this is something, it's simple, but then it can play good or bad depending on how bad the situation is. So it is good to know that increments of 15 is what you should plan for when you do a point-in-time restore, and when you take note of the date and timestamp for which you want to restore from. So once you give the information here with regards to from which point we have to restore and when should it be restored from a downtime perspective, you can, there are some acknowledgements that we have to click on, and then we can say submit. And so there are again validations in place where it says, it has to be within the previous 35 days. So I believe there is some showing restore point date should be from current date and time to the date. So let me do those. So it's going to schedule that. So now this is the service request that got created for this point-in-time restore. Now, until it is picked up, we can always cancel. We can always reschedule this specific service request. So let me just cancel so that we still have this environment, and that specific request is canceled. The second scenario will be to do a database refresh request. So this is where we want to copy data from either a production environment or one of the sandboxes as the source, and we have to copy the data to one of the sandbox environments. Again, if you notice, production is not listed in the target environment here because of the reasons we have already talked about. So if I select sandbox 1 to sandbox 2, and we have to set the downtime start and end time accordingly, and we acknowledge. Now here it doesn't say submit, it says next, because there is an additional set of acknowledgements that we have to acknowledge. Now if we go back, some of the acknowledgements that we see here are related to how data will be brought from production, and hence there are some additional checks and balances that as a customer and partner that we have to understand, and hence there is this additional set of acknowledgements. So once I acknowledge here and I submit, it's going to create a service request, and as always, let me cancel this here. So I just canceled that service request. Now, we can also see all the requests that has been completed so far on this environment. While I was preparing for the session, you can see there are so many service requests that actually got completed. So you can toggle this switch to see the history of the service requests, or you can also toggle this button to see only the ones that were canceled. So now let's talk about canceled service requests, right? So why would a service request be canceled? Now, there are two reasons for this to happen. Either as a customer and partner, you canceled the service request just like I did now, or you put in a service request for something that was not meant to be put a service request for, and Microsoft DSC behind the scene came back and canceled that specific service request, right? So sample scenarios where this can happen is, for example, somebody can put a service request to do a IIS reset on a sandbox, right? So we do not encourage to actually go and do IIS reset and put a service request for that. Instead, there is a product bug that is causing this specific situation to happen. So the idea will be to log a Microsoft support case and then get that identified as part of that flow, as opposed to putting a service request to get some things done, which should not be. So that is one scenario where we do not encourage to put service request and it will get canceled. And another scenario could be somebody putting a request to copy data from a sandbox to another sandbox. So we have seen that happen as well. Now, the ask in that will be, copy the data from the source and create a new database behind the scene and let us know what the database is. So we do not entertain such requests as well, because there is a standard process for doing a copy and restore, and that is what the Microsoft DSC team will follow. So if there are requests that do not align with the overall process flow, then those are the requests that will get canceled. So those were the set of scenarios for the database refresh request. Now, the other request is where we will, we talked about putting our environment in the maintenance mode or applying an ISV license package and whatnot. So this is where we will use the other request, and you can select the environment and you can give the specified downtime start date and downtime end date. And you can describe, so this is key in this specific request, which is you have to describe the request really well so that Microsoft DSC team can understand as to what exactly is being asked. And then you have to acknowledge and you can submit the request. Now, one thing to note here is the minimum downtime will be 1 hour. As you can see, it defaults to that. But the maximum downtime depends on the specific ask. Since this is a generic request, it cannot be determined ahead of time as to what will be the downtime. It just depends on what the ask is. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. So those were the flows for the other requests. Now, if I were to go back to our slide and quickly validate the scenarios. Yeah, so this is the last set of scenarios where we talked about refreshing the production itself, which has gone live. So basically for that, you'll have to put support ticket, just like you would put a support ticket for any other product issues. So we'll have to go through that specific flow, submit the support case to Microsoft, and then the support team will engage with the implementation team to understand what the situation is and then do what is right for that specific situation. If it means that there is a data refresh required, then support team will work with Microsoft DSC behind the scene to get that affected. You will not be asked to log a second service request to get that done. So that all happens as part of the single support case that you will file. So basically, these were the scenarios that I wanted to quickly go through. And I think we have pretty much covered all the scenarios. So at this time, I think we have around 25 minutes, a good amount of time for us to do some Q&A. So let's open up the floor for Q&A. Janice?
All right, thank you, Sunil. All right, audience, we're going to be starting our Q&A in just a moment, but before we do that, I would like to bring your attention to a link that I'm going to pop into the messages panel in just a moment. Let me get it in there for you. You should be seeing it on your screen right about now. That's a link to a short survey for this web conference, and we ask that you please take a moment before logging out to access it. We hope that you found today's information helpful, and if you enjoyed today's web conference or have feedback on how we can provide you with a better event, this is your chance to let us know. The survey scores are on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Sunil to answer the rest of the questions that are in the Q&A panel. Sunil?
Yes, thanks, Janice. So the first question is from Joshua Lee. Will there be an update to show the individual steps executing again? That was a helpful view. So Joshua, yes, so which is why I just started this again, where I just scheduled the deployable package deployment. Basically, what you will see here is either a failed step or it will show the currently executing step. So let it start. It should start within a minute or so. Let me refresh this. I just wanted to show you this one. It has not started actually, but basically you will see either the failed steps here or the currently executing steps. Hope that was that answered your question. The next question is from Paul Breed. Does an Azure subscription that has been attached to the tenant to allow multiple development qualify as a sandbox? If the question is, let me try to understand the essence of this question. If the question is trying to ask if we can use the same LCS flows to deploy code to a privately deployed environment in an Azure subscription, then the answer is no. This is only applied to all the environments that are there in the managed subscription. So hope that answered your question, Paul. The next question is from Hans. Would it be possible to do a database refresh from a specific point in the past? So basically a point in time restore to another environment. Hans, let me try to decipher this question. I think what you're trying to ask is, there is a Sandbox 1 environment and there is a Sandbox 2 environment. You want to refresh Sandbox 2 environment from a point in time restore in Sandbox 1. So your question is, can I request a data copy directly from 2 weeks before on Sandbox 1 to Sandbox 2? If that is the question, the answer is, the short answer is no, you cannot do a direct request for that. It will be a two-step process where you request a point-in-time restore in Sandbox 1 from that point in history. And once that is completed, then you request a data copy from Sandbox 1 to the Sandbox 2. I hope that is what you were asking and I answered your question. So the next question is from Lou Wong. Basically, Lou is saying interesting. So patching, code promotion, hotfixing, data deployments, etc. are all done via LCS regardless of tier 1 or tier 2. What about tier 1 cloud hosted within the same LCS project as production? LCS for those two. So that's a good question, Lou. So basically in the recent January release of LCS, we have enabled code deployments to tier 1 sandboxes as well. Basically the dev and test environments, which were not included in the first release of that functionality. So today it is available where you can actually go and deploy your deployable package to your dev and test from LCS using the exact same flow that I showed. But from a data perspective, no. So the data, the key thing to understand here is anytime there is a SQL server involved in the data scenarios, that is not currently available as an automation in LCS, right? So if I'm sure most of you are aware, so in the wiki, there are two dedicated articles that talks about how you can move data from SQL Azure to native SQL and how you can move data in the opposite direction from native SQL to SQL Azure. So there is a process that is defined. The project team has to go and execute that process to make sure the data is copied to the target environment. So I hope that answers your question on data as well. Any other questions? I'm not seeing any other questions in the panel here.
There are a couple in there. Go ahead and refresh your view there.
Okay, so I got one. Okay, I got one recent question from Hiren Nayak. Can you distinguish scenarios where partner customer can do deployment, DB restore versus where Microsoft service request required? So Hiren, I think the deck that you will get post this session, this specific slide talks about who owns the service operation from an execution perspective. So the customer and partner owns the code promotion or deployment of code to Sandbox environment. And when I say, the customer and partner performs, what it means is it is basically a real-time operation. The moment you say, schedule or submit, the runbook starts executing behind the scene. So it is a real-time operation, whereas the rest of the operations are owned by Microsoft DSC, where there is some checks and balances that happens before the automation is kicked off behind the scene. So hopefully that question is answered. So the next question is from Paul Breed. Is basically a follow-up from the previous question. Do you have an email where I can send a clarification of my question? Certainly, Paul. Janice, how do we share the email addresses? Can you clarify? Is that something we type in now in the window, or is that something that is shared later in the session?
We can share it out now if you'd like. I can certainly do that.
Yeah, can you please share our email addresses so that, not just, anyone in the call, if there is any question that I got it wrong and I did not answer it in the right way, so please send me clarification on those questions and we can certainly discuss that. And another option would be, I should actually clarify myself. So you should actually reach out to your corresponding SAs, the solution architect that you are working with on your project. Please reach out to them with the clarification questions, and those will get channeled to us as appropriately, and we can get back to you. So the next question is Lou. Lou, I think it is you're actually doing a follow-up of the previous question, which says, but restore is only from production. Lou, I think if you can send the clarification through your solution architect that you're working with, we can certainly take that clarification from you. There is a question from Jim. Can we discuss application of hotfixes? Certainly, Jim. So in the scenario that I talked about, let me go back to LCS. So basically, when I showed the asset library and I was talking about the deployable packages, I did mention, it can be either X++ deployable package, in which case, you could be downloading X++ hotfixes from LCS, and you go through the development process to make sure there are no conflicts if there is any customization that you have. If not, you can directly take that downloaded package, you can upload it to asset library, and then you can deploy using the flow that I just showed. So the answer to your question is yes, hotfixes certainly will follow the same process. The next question is from Peter Yang. Is Sandbox dev test environment constantly being backed up? And refresh dev test environment is something that LCS service request handles or something that partner does? So there are two questions here, Peter. So the first part of your question is the dev test environment constantly being backed up? The answer is no. The dev test environment is a native SQL Server based environment. So if there is a need for a project team to actually enable backup, certainly discuss with your solution architect and there is nothing stopping you from going and enabling backup on that native SQL server. But before doing that, discuss with the solution architect on your team assigned to you to discuss the scenario and then do what is right. The second half of your question was refresh dev test environment is something that LCS service request handles or something that partner does. So basically, yes, just like I was mentioning earlier, from a code deployment perspective, you can use the same flows that we saw today to deploy the code on your dev test environment. But for data, it is a native SQL server. So like I mentioned again earlier, it will be a process-based approach where you will restore or copy the data to that one box environment. There's a question from Jim. Can we also discuss how to determine your specific build number? Anyone from Microsoft side, Archana, or anyone else who can take this question? I don't have an answer right now.
Yeah, so I can start. Here's Claudia to answer this. So actually, right now, I mean, you can, if you want to know whether you can really see all the hotfixes applied in the build number, we're missing a certain piece of information there, which is to give you on the KB articles and issue search the build number as well. So we will be working on this. It's something we're actively working on right now because we do understand that it's rather difficult in experience at the moment to really see easily all the hot fixes that are applied when you look at your build information.
And Jim, if you still had questions around that specific topic, please, as I mentioned earlier, as a process itself, please reach out to your solution architect, and we can always circle back through that channel to help clarify your question. The next question is from Laura. Can we do DSC requests to install ISV DLLs in production? Is this allowed, or do they have to code around needing DLLs? So basically, the short answer to your question, Laura, is no. Basically, the DLLs or any ISV solution for that matter has to be part of a deployable package. You can have it as a separate deployable package that you can request to be deployed after you have deployed your solution package. Or there are different ways to do that, but basically it has to be through the deployable package route. The next question is from Lou. To be clear on the tier 1 LCS solution, on the LCS question, with the January release in our project, can LCS manage the deployments of cloud-hosted tier 1 environments, just like the tier 1 prepaid environments? No, Lou. So basically, the flows that we are seeing today is enabled only on the managed or the prepaid, as you are calling it on this question, environments, not the ones that you will deploy in your private Azure subscription. And yes, you can certainly follow up in the email also. Thank you. The next question is from Jim. Again, a follow-up to the question about hotfix application. Are you saying you can apply a hotfix directly without creating a new deployable package of the entire application suite, for example? So Jim, basically, if you're talking about the X++ hotfixes, you can certainly download the hotfixes package, and you can make sure it is part of your deployable package, and then you have to upload it to your asset library to get it deployed. If there is additional clarification required, please send that clarification to your solution architect, and we can get that addressed. The last question right now is from Yurek. How many times I can refresh Sandbox? Is there any limit on it? So theoretically, there is no limit to the number of times you can put a request. But make sure that the first request or the current request should be completed before you put in a second request. So currently, there are no additional questions that I'm seeing, Janice.
All right. Any final thoughts before we wrap up then?
Oh, there's one question that came up just now. Just a sec. for any report modification, will it still be through deployment package? I want to say yes, but I think at the same time, Janice, can we take note of this question so that we can get a final confirmation from the team and then we can get back?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and as there are no more questions in the queue, and I think we're just about done here, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up. So attendees, that's going to conclude today's web conference. You can access the web conference recording via a link that will be delivered within 3 to 5 days post-conference. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenter, Sunil, and thank you, audience, for logging in and joining us today. You may now disconnect from the broadcast.